Hello and welcome back again to Archaeology 101. I thought today I would go down a different route rather than carry on with these evolution videos, and today we're going to be looking at prehistoric bog bodies. Prehistoric bodies have been found from the Mesolithic period all the way to the Romano/Iron Age, a large sample coming from the latter. The oldest bog body example we have is Croghan Man, who was found in 1941 in Denmark and is preserved as a fleshless, partially complete skeleton. He was originally thought to have been a woman, but then DNA analysis in 2016 revealed otherwise. And later on in the lecture I will talk about some issues with older excavations of bog bodies. Bog bodies tend to be preserved within peat bogs, although there are other bogs as well. The oxygen-deprived anaerobic and cold environments prevent the growth of bacteria, thus slowing down the breakdown of organic material. Sphagnum bogs, for instance, contain sphagnum moss, which has a naturally antibacterial property, and these conserve the human body. The tannic acid in bog waters do not interact greatly with skin, which is also acidic, one of the contributing factors of flesh survival. It is also the tannins which produce that iconic tea bag brown colour seen on fleshed examples. Since the Mesolithic, people in northwest Europe have been depositing objects and even people into wetland areas. But what is the reasoning for these hundreds of unusually placed corpses though? Is there an innocent explanation? Or does it reveal something more sinister in the prehistoric past? Numerous theories have been produced, ranging from accidental drowning to human sacrifice, and every single one has some merit depending on the case study that you look at. In many of the more well-preserved examples, we can see a trend of violently inflicted wounds, predominantly bludgeoning of the head and face with a blunt instrument such as a club, strangulation, sometimes with cords or thongs made of leather, which are sometimes even preserved, and along with other materials, partial scalping or cropping of the hair, and the use of sharp objects, commonly slitting the throat or stabbing. Strangely, some individuals can be found with a combination of these injuries, and the plot thickens when we learn that most of the injuries probably happened after the victim had already perished. Very few items tend to be found alongside these bodies, although occasionally they can be accompanied by small, relatively fine garments. The Iron Age examples can have small leather or woven materials like capes and blankets, and often the victim was near enough naked and the garments placed over or next to the deceased, rather than actually wearing the item. Going back to the mode of death, I described that some bodies had multiple injuries. This overkill, if you will, has predominantly seen as a ritual sacrifice, or perhaps even as a form of punishment. Tacitus, the Roman classicist, describes how the Germanic people would hold down those who committed unnatural vice in the bog under wicker. Criscar claims that this could relate to homosexuality and promiscuity, or adultery. Tacitus, however, may not be an entirely trustworthy source. Indeed, many classical writers of the time were known to embellish on matters which they could also be separated from in both time and space. Nevertheless, Tacitus' description does corroborate with one example, the Haraldskær woman from Denmark, who was found pinned to the bog floor by branches and poles, most likely after she was already dead. The mode of death has been attributed to strangulation due to marks around her neck, and woolen clothes and a leather cape were laid on top of her naked body. Other cases follow a not so dissimilar pattern, but can arguably be more gruesome. Shellman from Ireland dated to around 2000 BC, and is one of the older bog bodies, yet still betrays his grisly fate. Multiple cuts from a sharp blade on his back and a broken arm, possibly a defensive wound, was the method of death. Unfortunately, he was badly damaged by a milling machine, and this compressed his body and caused many post-mortem breaks, which masks quite a few of the pre-mortem injuries, and it's quite hard to decipher what actually happened to him. There are some people who claim he was a sort of king and his sacrifice was his decommissioning ceremony, or it could just be a murder. There is certainly room to suggest people of nobility and high status were selected for this method of demise. Gravelman, for example, is thought to have been an elite of some description. His hands, which are very well preserved, were particularly soft and uncalloused. This is the opposite of what you would expect from a hard-working farming population, meaning he did very little in the way of manual labour. He dated to around the end of the 3rd century BC, and Gravelman was killed by having his throat viciously slit from ear to ear, severing both esophagus and his trachea. His exceptional preservation meant it was possible to see Harris lines on his bones, which means that sometime during his early lifetime he had suffered from malnutrition. This has also been seen in other bog bodies, meaning that malnutrition could have affected even those of higher status and not those just in the lower ranks. The final case study I will touch on, and which also contains overkill, is old Croghan Man, another Irish example. This very unfortunate male, who was only in his 20s, was not only stabbed in the chest, which was probably the cause of his death, but then his corpse was decapitated and his body halved for good measure, leaving only his torso and arms behind. Another note that has been made about old Croghan Man are some deep cuts under his nipples. Some people have claimed that this was part of the decomposition process. Others, however, have claimed that this was some sort of horrible torture, which may have happened while he was alive. The only items found accompanying him was a bronze and leather arm ring. Whether he was actually wearing clothes have either been discarded with his legs and head, or have been dissolved, which they can do under the wrong bog conditions. It is certainly possible, however, that he was completely naked at the time of his death. It is highly doubtful that people were inhumated in this manner for the same purposes. Gravelman certainly shows signs of defensive wounds. Old Croghan Man may have even been tortured, whereas other examples don't show any defensive wounds. I do ponder whether some of these people actually went willingly to their deaths. Nevertheless, whether it was to dispose of a murder victim, a ritual sacrifice, or just an unusual inhumation, these bodies are certainly eerie and perhaps uncomfortable time capsules right into the ancient past. Whether the people who inhumated the dead into the water knew that the bodies would remain preserved for thousands of years, the sources do not say, and I do wonder if these ancient people would wanted us to have known that they somehow committed these acts. Now, a few things to be mindful of when looking at bog bodies. Many of these bodies were excavated in the early 20th century, and if not even in earlier centuries. Therefore, handling of the specimens and the excavation of them were not up to date with today's standards, meaning that it's possible to lose organic evidence or be misinterpreted and then not looked over again, and that misinterpretation stays within the academic circles. Some bodies may even have been dug up and lost or destroyed, which you know some of them have been, especially during the destructive peat extracting processes. There are almost definitely more bog bodies out there, and there is so much that they can tell us from their stomach contents to the cut of their hair. Saying that, these people are highly unusual and have been placed in these conditions by other people. So even though it potentially shows ritualistic actions and criminals or elite, it doesn't demonstrate normal people or normal burial. Perhaps even the food in their stomachs was out of the ordinary, although numerous authorities have claimed that the cereal-heavy last meals would have been an Iron Age staple, perhaps a porridge or a porridge-like gruel. On the other hand, you can make the exact same arguments for burial, because people don't bury themselves, they don't have the objects that they desire buried with them, those are put in by other people. Therefore, bog bodies may actually be the best window into the prehistoric past, and we can see the flesh, the skin, the stomach contents, definitely causes of ritualistic violence and murder, and that they did some terrible things to one another, but some of these terrible things may have been done by a willing subject. Who knows? I hope you enjoyed today's video and have a better idea of what bog bodies contribute to archaeology. And with that, I will say goodbye, and I'll see you next time on Archaeology 101.